May 10, 1945. Wiesbaden, Germany. The war in Europe had ended only 2 days earlier. Outside, the roads were still crowded with abandoned military trucks, shattered artillery pieces, and columns of exhausted prisoners marching under armed escort. Smoke lingered above ruined railway yards, while church bells, silent through years of bombing, began to ring again across the shattered countryside. Inside a quiet interrogation room, the atmosphere was remarkably different. Large campaign maps still covered the walls. Colored pins marked battles that no longer mattered. American intelligence officers sat across from men who had once commanded hundreds of thousands of German soldiers. Their uniforms were faded, their medals removed, their authority gone. These officers were no longer planning offensives. They were answering questions. The Americans wanted to know how Germany had fought its war. What had worked? What had failed? And, perhaps most importantly, what their former enemy truly thought of the U.S. Army after years of relentless combat stretching from the deserts of North Africa to the heart of Germany. Some answers confirmed Allied expectations. Others surprised even the victors. The opinions recorded in those rooms would reveal a story far more complex than wartime propaganda, a story forged across thousands of miles of battlefields where respect was earned only through experience. The road to those remarkable admissions began years earlier, when many German commanders believed the United States would never become a decisive land power in Europe. When the Second World War erupted in September 1939, few military establishments in the world possessed the confidence of the German Wehrmacht. Within weeks, Poland had been defeated. Less than a year later, Denmark and Norway had fallen. Then came the stunning campaign in Western Europe. In only 6 weeks, the armies of Belgium, the Netherlands, and France collapsed before Germany's fast-moving combination of tanks, motorized infantry, artillery, and close air support. To many observers, the Wehrmacht appeared nearly unstoppable. This string of victories shaped not only the world's perception of Germany, but also the mindset of its own generals. Officers such as Heinz Guderian, Erich von Manstein, and Gerd von Rundstedt had witnessed a form of warfare that seemed revolutionary. Speed, surprise, and coordinated armored assaults repeatedly overwhelmed larger armies that relied on slower, more traditional methods. By the summer of 1941, Adolf Hitler believed that Germany stood at the height of its military power. On June 22, Operation Barbarossa began, the largest land invasion in history. More than 3 million German and Axis troops crossed into the Soviet Union along a front stretching nearly 1,800 miles. The opening months were devastating for the Red Army. Entire Soviet armies were surrounded at Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners marched westward. German commanders interpreted these victories as proof that no conventional army could withstand the Wehrmacht's operational methods. Across the Atlantic, however, another great industrial nation watched the conflict with growing concern. The United States remained officially neutral for much of the war's early years. Although President Franklin D. Roosevelt steadily increased support for Britain through measures such as Lend-Lease, American soldiers were not yet fighting on European battlefields. To many senior German officers, the United States represented immense industrial potential but questionable military capability. Their assumptions were shaped by history. The U.S. Army that entered the First World War in 1917 had been relatively small by European standards and had fought for only a brief period before the armistice. During the interwar years, America's armed forces shrank dramatically. Budget cuts, isolationist politics, and a lack of immediate threats meant that the regular army remained modest in size. In 1939, the U.S. Army ranked well below many European powers in manpower. German intelligence officers knew these facts. Many concluded that America possessed factories capable of producing weapons on an enormous scale but lacked experienced commanders and battle-hardened troops. Some believed American society, with its focus on civilian prosperity and distance from Europe's conflicts, would struggle to sustain the hardships of modern industrial warfare. These assumptions were not entirely unreasonable based on the evidence available in 1940. Yet they underestimated something far more significant: America's capacity to learn. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. The following day, the United States declared war on Japan. 4 days later, Germany declared war on the United States, transforming what had been largely a European conflict into a truly global war. Almost overnight, America's military expansion accelerated at an unprecedented pace. Millions of volunteers and conscripts entered training camps. New divisions formed across the country. Shipyards launched cargo vessels, destroyers, and aircraft carriers in numbers never before seen. Automobile factories began producing tanks. Civilian industries shifted toward bombers, trucks, engines, radios, ammunition, and countless other supplies essential for modern warfare. German planners certainly noticed these developments. What remained uncertain was whether quantity could become quality. Throughout 1942, many German commanders still believed that American forces would require years before becoming effective against experienced Wehrmacht units. They expected enthusiasm but not tactical sophistication. Equipment but not battlefield endurance. Resources but not operational excellence. That belief would soon be tested. The deserts of North Africa would provide the first large-scale encounter between German and American ground forces. There, under the harsh sun and across endless stretches of sand, inexperienced American soldiers would face veteran German formations commanded by one of Germany's most respected field marshals. The lessons learned in that campaign, often painful, sometimes costly, would begin transforming both armies. For the Americans, they revealed weaknesses that demanded immediate correction. For the Germans, they marked the first signs that the opponent they had underestimated possessed an extraordinary ability to adapt. Neither side fully understood it yet. But the opinions that captured German generals would later express in Allied interrogation. Rooms were already beginning to take shape, one battle at a time, under conditions where reputation meant little and performance meant everything. The proving ground for those changing perceptions lay not in conference rooms or intelligence reports, but on the battlefields of North Africa, where expectation collided with reality. The first major clash between American and German ground forces did not unfold in the hedgerows of Normandy or the forests of the Ardennes. It began in the vast deserts of North Africa, where visibility stretched for miles, supply lines determined survival, and mistakes could not be hidden. By late 1942, the United States had launched Operation Torch, landing troops in French North Africa alongside British forces. For many American soldiers, it was their first experience of modern combat. Their training had been thorough by peacetime standards, but it could not fully prepare them for facing veterans who had spent years fighting across Poland, France, the Balkans, and the Soviet Union. Those veterans belonged to the Afrika Korps, commanded by Field Marshal Owen Rommel. Rommel had earned a formidable reputation for rapid maneuver warfare, bold attacks, and an ability to exploit enemy mistakes with remarkable speed. His officers understood that hesitation on the battlefield often meant defeat. The Americans learned that lesson at the Battle of Kasserine Pass in February 1943. German armored formations struck inexperienced U.S. positions in western Tunisia, exposing weaknesses in American command, communication, and coordination. Some units became disorganized. Others withdrew under heavy pressure. Equipment was abandoned, and the battle revealed that the U.S. Army still had much to learn. To German commanders, Kasserine seemed to confirm many of their earlier assumptions. American soldiers appeared courageous enough, but inexperienced. Their battlefield coordination lacked the precision that German officers had come to expect from seasoned opponents. Yet something unusual happened after the battle. The United States did not simply replace lost equipment and continue as before. It studied every mistake. Command structures were revised. Training intensified. Cooperation between infantry, armor, artillery, and air power became far more integrated. Leaders who had struggled under combat conditions were reassigned, while experienced commanders assumed greater responsibility. Tactical lessons were distributed rapidly across the growing American army. This willingness to adapt impressed even German observers. By the time the Allied campaign in North Africa ended in May 1943, nearly 250,000 Axis troops had surrendered in Tunisia. Although Germany lost valuable soldiers and equipment, many German officers also recognized that the Americans they had fought only months earlier were already becoming more effective. The next test came with the invasion of Sicily in July 1943. the terrain differed completely from North Africa. Instead of open desert, Allied forces encountered rugged hills, narrow roads, and fortified defensive positions. German units conducted disciplined withdrawals, delaying the Allied advance while preserving much of their strength. American commanders were forced to solve new tactical problems almost daily. Again, the pattern repeated. Initial difficulties became valuable experience. The campaign in Italy that followed proved even more demanding. Rivers, mountains, winter weather, and well-prepared defensive lines slowed every advance. Battles such as Monte Cassino and the struggle along the Gustav Line became grinding contests of endurance rather than rapid maneuvers. German defensive doctrine excelled in such terrain. American forces, however, steadily improved their ability to coordinate artillery, engineers, armored support, and infantry attacks. Instead of relying on a single strength, they increasingly fought as an integrated system. Every branch supported the others, reducing the opportunities that German commanders had previously exploited. Meanwhile, another transformation was taking place far behind the front lines. American industry reached a scale that few had imagined possible. Factories produced thousands of tanks, aircraft, trucks, and artillery pieces every month. Shipyards launched Liberty ships faster than German submarines could sink them. Vast quantities of fuel, ammunition, spare parts, food, medical supplies, and replacement equipment crossed the Atlantic despite the ongoing Battle of the Atlantic. For German commanders, this industrial capacity became impossible to ignore. They increasingly found themselves facing opponents who not only replaced losses quickly but often appeared with even greater strength after each campaign. Destroyed bridges were rebuilt. Damaged roads were repaired. New vehicles arrived in remarkable numbers. Airfields expanded almost as rapidly as advancing armies. Then came June 6, 1944. The Normandy landings Operation Overlord opened the long-awaited Western Front. For the German High Command, this represented the greatest military challenge since the invasion of the Soviet Union. Hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers crossed the English Channel under the protection of overwhelming naval and air power. American divisions that landed on Omaha Beach suffered severe casualties during the opening hours. Yet despite confusion and devastating fire, many small groups continued advancing inland. Junior officers, non-commissioned officers, and ordinary riflemen frequently took independent action when carefully prepared plans collapsed. German reports increasingly noted this resilience. As the campaign continued through the hedgerows of Normandy, across France, and toward the German border, American forces demonstrated something that many German generals had not expected in 1942, the ability to absorb setbacks, analyze failures, and return stronger. By late 1944, the U.S. Army was no longer the inexperienced force encountered at Kasserine Pass. It had become one of the most capable military organizations in the world, supported by unmatched logistics, overwhelming industrial production, and a growing corps of combat experienced leaders. Many German commanders still believed their soldiers were superior in certain tactical skills, particularly in defensive operations and small unit maneuver. But they increasingly acknowledged that winning battles required more than tactical brilliance alone. The Americans had mastered the larger system of modern war. That realization would become unmistakable during the war's final campaigns, when captured German generals began explaining not only how they had fought but why, despite their experience, they had ultimately failed against the United States and its allies. Those explanations reveal several distinct themes, each highlighting a different strength that German commanders came to recognize only after years of relentless combat. For many German commanders, the most striking characteristic of the U.S. Army was not the individual rifleman. It was the overwhelming weight of coordinated fire that stood behind him. The Wehrmacht had entered the war believing decisive victories would come through maneuver, fast-moving armored thrusts supported by artillery and aircraft. In the early years, that doctrine had shattered larger armies before they could react. By 1944, however, American forces had refined a different kind of battlefield dominance. Whenever German troops located an American position and prepared to attack, they often discovered they were not facing a single infantry company. They were confronting an entire network. Forward observers hidden with frontline units could call for artillery support within minutes. Radio communication linked infantry, armored units, engineers, and aircraft with remarkable speed. Instead of fighting isolated battles, American formations fought as connected systems. German veterans repeatedly described the precision and volume of American artillery. Batteries located miles behind the front could concentrate hundreds of shells onto a single objective with devastating accuracy. Defensive positions that had resisted infantry attacks for days sometimes became untenable after only minutes of coordinated bombardment. Captured officers later acknowledged that this constant availability of artillery changed the psychology of battle. German commanders could no longer assume that local tactical superiority would guarantee success. Every attack risked triggering an overwhelming response that disrupted formations before they could exploit an opening. What impressed them most was consistency. American artillery was not merely powerful. It was reliable. Regardless of weather, terrain, or time of day, German units learned that nearly every engagement might bring a carefully coordinated storm of high explosives. The battlefield itself seemed to answer every American call for help. If artillery won battles, logistics made those battles possible. Many captured German generals later argued that America's greatest weapon was not a tank, a bomber, or even a particular general. It was its ability to sustain war on a scale Germany could never match. Every American division required an enormous daily flow of fuel, food, ammunition, spare parts, medical supplies, replacement vehicles, and engineering equipment. Keeping that system moving across oceans and continents demanded an industrial and transportation effort unlike anything previously attempted. German intelligence had recognized America's industrial capacity before the war. What many officers underestimated was how efficiently those resources could be delivered to the front. Following the breakout from Normandy in August 1944, Allied armies advanced so rapidly that supply lines struggled to keep pace. To solve the problem, the Allies organized the Red Ball Express, a massive trucking network operating day and night. Thousands of mostly African American drivers transported fuel, ammunition, and supplies from Normandy's beaches to advancing armies deep inside France. For German commanders attempting to slow the Allied advance, this presented a frustrating reality. Destroying one convoy accomplished little. Another appeared. Bombing a railway junction delayed shipments only temporarily. Engineers repaired bridges with astonishing speed. Damaged roads reopened within hours or days. Replacement vehicles arrived in quantities that Germany could scarcely imagine during the final years of the war. By late 1944, many Wehrmacht units faced chronic shortages of fuel and ammunition. Some armored formations possessed tanks but lacked gasoline to move them. Others conserved artillery shells because fresh supplies could not reach the front. Across the battlefield, American units continued receiving what they needed with remarkable regularity. Captured German generals increasingly concluded that defeating the United States required more than tactical brilliance. It required overcoming an industrial system that seemed capable of replacing almost every loss faster than Germany could inflict it. Perhaps the greatest surprise for many German commanders was not American strength. It was American speed of improvement. The Wehrmacht had entered the war with years of combat experience. Many German officers had served since the First World War or had participated in campaigns across Europe before encountering American forces. They expected inexperienced opponents to repeat the same mistakes. Instead, they watched those mistakes disappear. The defeat at Kasserine Pass became one of the clearest examples. Rather than defending poor decisions or blaming circumstances, the U.S. Army conducted detailed after-action reviews. Command structures were reorganized. Training emphasized cooperation between infantry, armor, artillery, engineers, and air support. Lessons learned in Tunisia were quickly shared with units preparing for future operations. German commanders noticed. Tactics that had succeeded only months earlier became increasingly ineffective. American officers demonstrated a willingness to adapt rather than cling to doctrine. Junior leaders exercised initiative when communication failed. New equipment reached the battlefield alongside revised tactics designed around actual combat experience instead of peacetime theory. Some captured German generals later remarked that the U.S. Army resembled a vast institution constantly studying itself. Every battle generated reports. Every failure became a lesson. Every lesson influenced the next campaign. This process did not eliminate mistakes. No army in history has achieved that. But it steadily reduced them. By the campaigns in France and Western Germany, the Americans confronting the Wehrmacht were far different from those first encountered in North Africa. Experience had sharpened their judgment, while industrial strength ensured they possessed the resources to apply what they had learned. The result was an opponent who became more dangerous with every passing month, a transformation that many German generals admitted they had never fully anticipated. By 1945, these battlefield realities had changed more than German tactics, they had changed German opinions. Yet the deepest respect many commanders expressed was reserved not for American machines, but for the soldiers who operated them. To many outside observers, the overwhelming industrial power of the United States explained nearly every Allied victory. Captured German generals often offered a more nuanced assessment. Factories could build tanks. Shipyards could launch landing craft. Steel mills could produce artillery. But none of those mattered unless ordinary soldiers could turn those resources into battlefield success. German commanders who fought American units from Normandy to the Rhine frequently commented on the resilience of the individual U.S. soldier. They noted that while American troops were sometimes less experienced than veteran German formations early in the war, they rarely lacked determination once engaged. This resilience became especially evident after plans unraveled. Combat seldom followed carefully prepared maps. Officers were killed. Radios failed. Smoke obscured landmarks. Units became separated. Rather than waiting for detailed instructions, American junior officers and non-commissioned officers often took independent action. Small groups reorganized themselves, bypassed strongpoints, or called for supporting fire without waiting for higher headquarters. German reports increasingly reflected this decentralization. It complicated defensive planning because disrupting one headquarters did not necessarily halt an American advance. The U.S. Army also benefited from a deep pool of educated personnel familiar with increasingly sophisticated communications equipment. Radio operators, engineers, artillery observers, mechanics, and medical teams all contributed to maintaining momentum under difficult conditions. Captured German officers sometimes contrasted this with Germany's growing shortages during the final years of the war. Experienced specialists became increasingly difficult to replace, while American formations generally continued receiving trained reinforcements. By 1945, many German generals concluded that America's greatest military asset was not simply its industrial base. It was the ability of ordinary soldiers to integrate training, technology, and initiative into an increasingly effective fighting force. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, Allied intelligence officers interviewed dozens of senior commanders. Some participated in formal interrogations. Others later wrote memoirs or contributed to the U.S. Army's Foreign Military Studies program during the early Cold War. These sources reveal a consistent pattern, but not a single, unanimous opinion. General Friedrich von Mellenthin wrote extensively about Allied operations after the war. He acknowledged the immense advantages created by American production, mobility, and logistics, arguing that modern warfare depended on sustaining armies as much as maneuvering them. General Otto von Manschufel frequently praised American artillery coordination and air support. While he believed German tactical doctrine remained highly effective in many situations, he also recognized that overwhelming Allied resources steadily narrowed Germany's options as the war progressed. Heinz Guderian, whose memoir Panzer Leader examined Germany's strategic failures, repeatedly emphasized the decisive impact of Allied industrial production. Although his writings focused primarily on Germany's own mistakes, they also acknowledged that American manufacturing power fundamentally altered the balance of the war. Even officers who remained critical of certain American tactics often admitted respect for the scale of Allied coordination. However, historians urge caution. Many post-war memoirs were written years after the conflict and sometimes reflected personal motivations, selective memory, or attempts to explain Germany's defeat. Some commanders emphasized Allied material superiority while downplaying strategic errors made by the German High Command. For that reason, modern historians compare these memoirs with wartime documents, interrogation records, operational reports, and battlefield evidence rather than accepting any single account at face value. Taken together, the evidence shows that captured German generals did not portray the US Army as unbeatable. They portrayed it as an opponent that learned rapidly, coordinated effectively, and ultimately mastered the industrial demands of modern war. The respect expressed by many captured German generals should not be mistaken for unconditional praise. Professional soldiers evaluate both strengths and weaknesses, even in victorious opponents. Several German commanders argued that American forces sometimes relied heavily on artillery and air power before launching infantry assaults. From their perspective, this reflected an effort to reduce casualties whenever possible. German officers occasionally interpreted such methods as cautious, particularly when compared with the Wehrmacht's emphasis on rapid maneuver during the early years of the war. American commanders viewed the same practice differently. If superior firepower could destroy enemy defenses before infantry advanced, fewer soldiers would be exposed to direct fire. It was not merely a question of caution, it was an application of overwhelming resources to preserve lives while maintaining operational momentum. German officers also observed that newly arrived American units occasionally lacked the experience of long-serving Wehrmacht formations. Yet they repeatedly noted how quickly those same units improved after only a short period in combat. Perhaps the greatest frustration expressed in post-war interviews concerned time itself. Germany's tactical innovations often achieved local success. But local success increasingly failed to influence the wider war. An American bridge destroyed by artillery could be rebuilt. A damaged armored battalion received replacement vehicles. Aircraft losses were replenished. Fuel continued arriving. Fresh divisions entered the theater. By contrast, Germany's shrinking industrial base, fuel shortages, and relentless Allied bombing made recovery progressively more difficult. This imbalance shaped many post-war assessments. Captured generals frequently concluded that although German soldiers often fought skillfully at the tactical level, the United States and its allies had mastered warfare at the operational and strategic levels, where logistics, industry, communications, and sustained combat power ultimately determined victory. Their admissions were therefore not simply compliments. They were acknowledgments of a new reality that had emerged across 6 years of global war. That reality would reach its ultimate test during the final campaigns of 1944 and 1945, when Germany launched one last desperate offensive before the collapse of the Third Reich became inevitable. December 16, 1944. 5:30 a.m. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Snow covered the narrow roads. A thick fog hung between the pine trees, muffling the sound of engines moving through the darkness. Then, without warning, more than 1,500 German artillery pieces erupted almost simultaneously. Shells crashed across American positions from Monshaw in the north to Echternach in the south, shattering the quiet winter morning. It was Hitler's final major offensive in the west. The operation, known as the Battle of the Bulge, was Germany's last attempt to reverse the course of the war. Hitler believed that by driving through the Ardennes, crossing the Meuse River, and capturing the vital port of Antwerp, he could split the British and American armies, force the Western Allies into political negotiations, and concentrate Germany's remaining strength against the Soviet Union. The plan depended on speed. German armored spearheads had to repeat the kind of lightning campaign that had brought victory through the same forests in 1940. But 4 years had changed Europe. More importantly, they had changed the army waiting on the other side. The opening days were undeniably successful for the Germans. American units along the thinly defended front were surprised by the scale of the assault. Several inexperienced divisions suffered heavy losses. Communications broke down. Roads became clogged with retreating vehicles and civilians fleeing the fighting. Some isolated companies fought until they exhausted their ammunition. Others were surrounded. Entire headquarters found themselves cut off from neighboring formations. To German commanders, the first 48 hours appeared promising. Yet beneath the confusion, another pattern emerged. American resistance did not collapse. Instead, it fragmented into hundreds of independent pockets. At villages such as St. Vith, engineers, tank crews, artillerymen, military police, and infantry units, many from different divisions, formed improvised defensive lines. Their mission was simple: delay the German advance for as long as possible. Every hour mattered. Each destroyed bridge. Each roadblock. Each defended crossroads. All bought time for reinforcements to arrive. One of the most remarkable examples unfolded at Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne Division, joined by elements of several other units, found itself surrounded by advancing German forces. The town possessed little strategic value by itself. Its roads did. 7 major highways converged there, making Bastogne a vital transportation hub for any army attempting to advance westward. German commanders understood this immediately. They demanded the town's surrender. The American response became one of the most famous moments of the war. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe replied with a single word: "Nuts." The message was brief. Its meaning was unmistakable. The defenders would continue fighting. For days, German artillery pounded Bastogne. Snow and freezing temperatures made resupplying nearly impossible. Medical supplies dwindled. Ammunition became scarce. Wounded soldiers crowded aid stations established in cellars and damaged buildings. Still, the defense held. Captured German officers later admitted that American determination during battles like Bastogne disrupted carefully prepared operational timetables. The offensive depended on maintaining momentum. Every delay consumed precious fuel. Every hour allowed more Allied units to reach the battlefield. Then the weather changed. For nearly a week, heavy clouds had grounded much of the Allied air forces. On December 23, clear skies finally appeared over the Ardennes. Within hours, hundreds of Allied aircraft filled the air. Fighter bombers attacked German columns trapped on narrow roads. Transport aircraft dropped desperately needed ammunition, food, medicine, and winter clothing to the defenders of Bastogne. German supply lines, already strained by fuel shortages, came under relentless attack. Captured commanders later described this moment as one of the decisive turning points of the offensive. Without air superiority, German armored formations became increasingly vulnerable. Fuel trucks burned. Bridges were destroyed. Traffic jams stretched for miles. Every lost vehicle became another obstacle blocking those behind it. At the same time, American artillery once again demonstrated the coordination that German officers had come to respect throughout the war. Observers positioned near the front directed concentrated fire onto advancing German formations with remarkable speed. Entire battalions found themselves halted before they could deploy effectively. The offensive slowed. Then it began to reverse. General George S. Patton executed one of the most celebrated operational maneuvers of the campaign. After anticipating the possibility of a German winter offensive, Patton had already begun contingency planning. When the attack came, the U.S. Third Army pivoted north with extraordinary speed, covering difficult winter terrain to relieve the defenders at Bastogne. To many German commanders, this demonstrated something they had increasingly observed since Normandy. American operational flexibility had reached a level they could no longer dismiss. The army they had once viewed as inexperienced now coordinated massive troop movements, logistics, artillery, armor, and air support with impressive efficiency even during one of the harshest winters of the war. Yet despite these growing setbacks, Hitler refused to abandon the offensive. His remaining armored forces continued pushing westward. The decisive struggle had not yet ended. Ahead lay the final collapse of Germany's last great gamble, and with it, the battlefield experiences that many captured generals would later recall when explaining why victory had slipped beyond their reach. The final weeks of the Ardennes campaign would transform Germany's last offensive into the beginning of the Third Reich's irreversible collapse. December 26, 1944. Bastogne. The first tanks of the U.S. Third Army finally broke through to the besieged town. Their arrival did not end the fighting, but it ended Germany's hope of capturing the critical road junction before Allied reinforcements could fully concentrate. The encirclement had been broken. For the German High Command, time was becoming the greatest enemy. The offensive had been designed around a narrow window of opportunity. Every day that passed consumed fuel that could not be replaced, ammunition that could not be replenished, and experienced soldiers that Germany could no longer afford to lose. Hitler refused to accept the reality developing on the battlefield. He continued ordering attacks toward objectives that had become increasingly unreachable. Field commanders understood the problem. Many armored divisions possessed tanks but insufficient gasoline. Others had enough fuel for only a single major movement before becoming immobile. Recovery vehicles struggled to retrieve damaged equipment under constant Allied artillery and air attack. Trucks abandoned for lack of fuel littered frozen roads across the Ardennes. Captured German officers later described these shortages as devastating. Even brilliantly planned tactical maneuvers depended on mobility. Without fuel, Germany's prized Panther and Tiger tanks became little more than stationary strongpoints. As the weather remained clear, Allied aircraft intensified their attacks. American and British fighter bombers swept over bridges, crossroads, railway junctions, and columns of vehicles. German movements increasingly took place at night or beneath forest cover, slowing the advance even further. Meanwhile, American logistics continued functioning with remarkable effectiveness. Replacement troops arrived. Damaged bridges were repaired. Medical evacuation routes remained active despite winter conditions. Fresh artillery ammunition reached frontline batteries. The contrast became impossible for German commanders to ignore. One army struggled to sustain an offensive. The other grew stronger with each passing day. By early January 1945, the initiative had shifted completely. General Dwight D. Eisenhower coordinated a broad counteroffensive. American, British, and other Allied formations attacked from multiple directions, gradually compressing the German salient that had created the bulge in Allied lines. The fighting remained fierce. German soldiers defended villages, forests, and ridgelines with determination, hoping to delay the inevitable. Many units continued resisting despite dwindling supplies, believing that every additional day might allow Germany to regroup. It never happened. By January 25, 1945, the Battle of the Bulge had effectively ended. The front had largely returned to its previous position. Germany had lost irreplaceable men, tanks, vehicles, and aircraft. Perhaps even more damaging, it had exhausted much of the strategic reserve intended to defend the homeland itself. The consequences reached far beyond Belgium. Within weeks, Allied armies resumed their advance toward the Rhine. Engineers prepared for one of the most challenging operations of the European campaign, crossing Germany's last major natural defensive barrier. Then came an unexpected opportunity. On March 7, 1945, soldiers of the U.S. 9th Armored Division reached the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen. German demolition teams had attempted to destroy the bridge. The explosion damaged it but failed to bring it down. Recognizing the opportunity, American troops rushed across under enemy fire. Engineers immediately began reinforcing the damaged structure while additional pontoon bridges were constructed nearby. Captured German commanders later acknowledged that the failure to destroy the bridge represented a serious setback. Instead of spending weeks forcing a contested river crossing, Allied forces established a bridgehead on the eastern bank far sooner than German planners expected. Thousands of soldiers crossed. Then tens of thousands. Soon, entire divisions were operating east of the Rhine. The final defensive line had been breached. From that point onward, the collapse accelerated. American armored columns advanced rapidly through western Germany, bypassing isolated pockets of resistance whenever possible. Cities fell one after another. Industrial centers were occupied. Railway networks ceased functioning effectively. German command structures deteriorated. Communications became increasingly fragmented. Orders issued from Berlin often reached units too late or not at all. Some commanders attempted organized withdrawals. Others discovered they no longer possessed the transportation needed to execute them. By April, American forces had encircled the Ruhr pocket, trapping more than 300,000 German troops. It became one of the largest mass surrenders of German forces in the Western theater. For many senior officers, the military situation had become undeniable. The Wehrmacht still contained courageous soldiers. It still possessed capable commanders. But courage alone could not compensate for empty fuel depots, shattered transportation networks, overwhelming Allied air superiority, and an industrial imbalance that had become insurmountable. On May 7, 1945, at Reims, France, Colonel General Alfred Jodl signed Germany's unconditional surrender on behalf of the German High Command. The surrender took effect on May 8, remembered across Europe as Victory in Europe Day. The guns gradually fell silent. Yet another chapter was just beginning. Senior German commanders who had directed armies across nearly every front of the war now found themselves sitting across tables from Allied intelligence officers. They were asked to reconstruct campaigns, to explain decisions, to analyze victories, to admit mistakes. Most importantly, they were asked one question that would echo through decades of military history. What had they learned from fighting the United States Army? Their answers, sometimes critical, sometimes respectful, often remarkably candid, would become part of the historical record, offering future generations a rare glimpse into how defeated commanders evaluated the force that had helped bring the Third Reich to an end. Those interviews did not celebrate victory or excuse defeat. Instead, they preserved professional military judgments whose influence extended far beyond the end of the Second World War. May 1945. Europe was finally quiet. For nearly 6 years, the continent had echoed with artillery fire, aircraft engines, and the movement of millions of soldiers. Now, the silence felt unfamiliar. Across Germany, Allied occupation forces began the enormous task of restoring order. Cities lay in ruins. Bridges had collapsed into rivers. Rail networks were broken. Millions of displaced civilians searched for food, shelter, and missing family members. At the same time, another operation, far less visible but equally important, was beginning. The Allies wanted to understand exactly how the German military had fought the war. This was not an exercise in admiration. It was preparation for the future. American and British intelligence officers systematically interviewed hundreds of captured German officers, from division commanders to field marshals. Their objective was straightforward: preserve military knowledge before it disappeared with the defeated Wehrmacht. These interrogations covered every aspect of the war. How had German armored formations coordinated attacks? Why had certain defensive operations succeeded? How were logistics organized on the Eastern Front? What mistakes had led to Germany's defeat? And increasingly, one additional question appeared. How did experienced German commanders evaluate the armies they had faced? The answers revealed remarkable consistency. Few German officers claimed that the United States possessed the most experienced soldiers at the beginning of the war. Many acknowledged that Germany had entered the conflict with a professional army shaped by years of preparation and early battlefield success. But they also described something they had not expected. The Americans improved at an extraordinary pace. Interrogation reports frequently noted that American commanders responded quickly to battlefield failures. Tactical errors identified in one campaign rarely remained unchanged in the next. Training evolved continuously, and lessons learned in Tunisia, Sicily, Italy, and Normandy spread throughout the growing army. For professional soldiers, this ability mattered enormously. Every military makes mistakes. The decisive difference often lies in how rapidly those mistakes are corrected. Several German officers also emphasized the effectiveness of American staff work. Behind every frontline division stood thousands of planners, engineers, logistics specialists, intelligence analysts, and communications personnel. Orders moved efficiently through headquarters. Supplies reached combat units with remarkable consistency. Replacement equipment often arrived before shortages became critical. To many German commanders, this reflected an understanding of modern warfare that extended far beyond individual battles. Victory depended on sustaining armies, not merely inspiring them. These observations later proved valuable to American military education. During the late 1940s and early 1950s, numerous former German officers participated in the Foreign Military Studies program, producing detailed analyses of campaigns on both the Eastern and Western fronts. Conducted under U.S. Army supervision, these studies examined tactics, logistics, command decisions, intelligence, and operational planning. American officers did not accept every conclusion without question. Many reports reflected the authors' personal experiences and, at times, their attempts to explain Germany's defeat in ways that emphasized overwhelming Allied resources rather than strategic errors within the Nazi leadership. Historians have since compared these writings with wartime records, operational reports, and archival documents to separate reliable analysis from post-war interpretation. Even so, the studies became influential. Military academies examined them alongside Allied records to understand both strengths and weaknesses displayed during the conflict. One recurring lesson emerged repeatedly. The United States had not defeated Germany through a single superior weapon or one brilliant commander. It had succeeded by combining industry, logistics, intelligence, technology, adaptable leadership, and disciplined soldiers into a unified system capable of sustaining continuous operations across multiple continents. Captured German generals recognized this integration. Many had entered the war believing tactical excellence alone could secure victory. By 1945, they had witnessed the limits of that belief. The modern battlefield demanded something larger, an entire national system working in harmony with the forces at the front. For future generations of military planners, that lesson became just as significant as any individual battle fought during the war. Yet the influence of those wartime assessments did not end inside military classrooms. In the decades that followed, historians would revisit these testimonies, testing them against newly opened archives and asking an even more important question: how accurate were the generals' own explanations of defeat? As the decades passed, the testimonies of captured German generals became some of the most frequently cited sources in books, documentaries, and military studies about the Second World War. But historians approached them with increasing caution. The men giving these interviews had commanded armies during one of history's most destructive conflicts. They were valuable witnesses, but they were also participants with their own perspectives, loyalties, and reasons for explaining the past in particular ways. One recurring theme appeared in many post-war memoirs. German commanders often emphasized the overwhelming industrial and logistical superiority of the United States and its allies. On many points, they were correct. By 1944, American factories were producing thousands of aircraft, tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, and millions of tons of supplies. Allied shipping crossed the Atlantic in a continuous flow, while engineers repaired roads, ports, and bridges with extraordinary speed. The ability to sustain armies over vast distances became one of the defining strengths of the Allied war effort. Yet historians also noted what some memoirs tended to minimize. Germany's defeat was not caused by Allied production alone. Strategic decisions made by Adolf Hitler repeatedly placed the Wehrmacht in impossible situations. The invasion of the Soviet Union opened an enormous eastern front that consumed men and equipment on a staggering scale. Declaring war on the United States after Pearl Harbor brought the world's largest industrial economy fully into the European conflict. Later, Hitler's refusal to authorize timely withdrawals often trapped experienced formations that might otherwise have fought another day. These political and strategic choices shaped the outcome of the war as much as battlefield tactics. Even so, when historians compared German recollections with wartime operational records, a remarkable consistency emerged regarding the American army. German reports written during the war, not years afterward, already described the increasing effectiveness of U.S. artillery coordination, engineering capability, communications, and logistics. These observations appeared in situation reports, intelligence summaries, and field assessments prepared long before Germany surrendered. That consistency strengthened the credibility of many post-war admissions. It suggested that at least some conclusions were not products of hindsight but reflections of experiences recorded while the fighting was still underway. Another important finding involved leadership. The popular image of World War II often focuses on famous generals. Yet countless wartime reports emphasized something less dramatic: the effectiveness of junior officers and non-commissioned officers. Platoon leaders, company commanders, artillery observers, engineers, radio operators, and sergeants frequently solved immediate battlefield problems without waiting for detailed instructions from higher headquarters. German officers repeatedly encountered this decentralized style of command during the campaigns in France, Belgium, and Germany. It made American formations difficult to disrupt. Destroying a headquarters did not necessarily halt an advance. Local leaders continued making decisions, coordinating supporting fire, and adapting to changing conditions. This flexibility became one of the defining characteristics of the U.S. Army by the final year of the war. Historians also emphasize another point often overlooked in simplified narratives. Respect between professional soldiers did not erase the broader reality of the conflict. The Wehrmacht served a regime responsible for aggressive war and immense crimes across Europe. Many German officers fought skillfully as military professionals, but their operational abilities cannot be separated entirely from the wider context of the Nazi state's actions. Recognizing professional assessments of battlefield performance does not diminish the suffering inflicted by the war or excuse the policies that caused it. Instead, those assessments help explain how the fighting unfolded. By examining the observations of defeated commanders alongside Allied records, historians gain a fuller understanding of why victory belonged to the Allies, not because of one miracle weapon or one decisive battle, but because military effectiveness grew from the combination of strategy, leadership, industrial capacity, logistics, intelligence, technology, and the determination of millions of soldiers and civilians. The captured German generals had lost the war. Yet many of their professional evaluations survived because future generations recognized that even defeated commanders could offer valuable insight, provided their words were weighed carefully against the historical evidence. Their admissions became part of a larger lesson. Not about invincibility. Not about myth. But about the reality that modern warfare is won not only by courage at the front, but also by the countless people, decisions, and systems working far behind it. When the smoke of battle finally cleared, the greatest lesson was not simply who had won the war, but why. That final reflection belongs not to the battlefield, but to history itself. When the Second World War ended in Europe, millions celebrated the silence that followed years of destruction. Cities would be rebuilt. Armies would return home. Former enemies would slowly become allies. But history would continue asking the same question. Why did the Allies win? The answers cannot be found in a single battle, one brilliant general, or one revolutionary weapon. Captured German generals, despite their different personalities and perspectives, repeatedly pointed toward a broader truth. They had fought an opponent that refused to remain the same. The United States Army entered the war inexperienced by European standards, yet it learned from defeat, adapted to new challenges, and combined its soldiers with an industrial and logistical system unlike anything the world had previously witnessed. That transformation did not happen overnight. It was built through difficult campaigns in North Africa, the mountains of Italy, the beaches of Normandy, the frozen forests of the Ardennes, and the final advance across Germany. Every setback became a lesson. Every lesson strengthened the force that would eventually stand on the Rhine in the spring of 1945. The observations left behind by captured German commanders are valuable not because they offer the final word on history, but because they reveal how professional soldiers evaluated the enemy they had spent years trying to defeat. Their testimonies gain meaning when read alongside Allied records, wartime reports, and modern historical research. Together, they remind us that victory in modern war depends on far more than battlefield courage. It depends on leadership that can adapt, industry that can endure, logistics that never stop moving, technology that serves strategy rather than replacing it, and ordinary men and women whose countless unseen efforts keep an army fighting long after the first shot is fired. The ruins of Europe eventually gave way to new cities, new alliances, and a new world shaped by the lessons of that conflict. Yet the quiet conversations held in Allied interrogation rooms after Germany's surrender remain part of that legacy. Not because they glorified war, but because they revealed an enduring truth. The most revealing measure of an army is sometimes found not in its own victories, but in the honest respect earned from those who fought against it.